Just going to give everyone a second to join here. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Glad to have you here. Thanks for joining tonight. And I'm looking forward to talking all things law school application with you guys and answering any of your questions. So a little bit before we begin and jump in, I just want to go over Leland is having law school week right now. There are a bunch of very, very amazing events about things like the LSAT, personal statements, and just the law school application process in general from some top-notch coaches who have a lot of insight and knowledge that you guys get access to for free. So I highly recommend you guys attend these events, no matter where you are in the process, whether you're just starting out or you're very late in the game. There's so much to be gleaned from this. So I highly, highly recommend you check this out. And before we get into the Q&A, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Jack. I went to Tulane University for undergraduate, and I was admitted into the junior deferral program at Harvard Law School, which entails a 2-year deferral of admission upon graduation, which I am currently in. So I'm happy to talk about that to you guys. If there's any questions about that, I know people always have questions about it. But outside of that, I've been coaching on Leland for almost a year. I coach both the LSAT and law school admissions. I love sort of demystifying and de-stressing what can be a very stressful and confusing process, both the LSAT and law school admissions. And today, I'm very happy to share my knowledge with you guys and open the floor to you. So without further ado, we can get into the questions. I think the way we're going to do the Q&A is you guys are going to put them in the chat. There's a lot of people here, so I might not get to every single one, but I'm going to prioritize those that have the most broad applicability so that everyone can get the most value. And if there is a very specific situation, I highly recommend you guys reach out to me on Leland and we can discuss it further. So feel free to drop your questions in the chat and I'll start going through them. Okay, so the first question I see here is LSAT versus GRE. So I think it's a it's a good question, and it's a very specific question to you. There isn't really one answer. They're very similar tests, but there are a lot of differences. The GRE has more quant-focused sections, and if you are someone who is maybe less inclined towards numbers, the LSAT is there. I think that there is generally the same amount of infrastructure for prepping for both. So I think my best advice would really be to just take a practice test of both tests and sort of see which one you are more comfortable with. There's no real, as far as weighting goes, I don't believe that adcoms really weight one over the other. The next one, okay, so this is talking about T14 ED scholarships. So the question is, if you apply early decision to one of those schools that offer it and get in, but you get a higher scholarship from another T14 school that you applied to regular decision, can you negotiate for a higher scholarship or can you not because ED is binding? So ED is binding. So if you apply ED, you are bound to attend. There are ways to get out of that, but generally speaking, you can't really negotiate. And I know you're referring to schools like Northwestern that have a big scholarship package. Generally, in my experience, that scholarship is pretty fixed. I mean, they actually list the number on their website. So it's highly unlikely that they would change or modify that for an individual case. And also, if you apply ED, you should always apply with the intent to go and not to kind of negotiate once you get in. How to get off the wait list. So very, very case-by-case basis, but it's a combination of sort of luck, waiting, and sending what is called a letter of continued interest. And that is sort of a topic for much longer. There's a lot of great resources online. You can type in LOCI, but it really depends on your specific case. And you're basically just making a case for yourself as to why they should reconsider you. How to determine the number of schools to apply to. So this is a great question. I think when evaluating what schools you should apply to and what number of schools, there's a number of factors that go into it. Obviously, if you have geographic constraints, that's a very high one. Also, financial constraints are very high. Generally speaking, you want to have a good number of safeties, targets, and then reaches, kind of like undergraduate. Anywhere from 6 schools, that people apply to 10 schools or more. It's not that the law school applications, while they vary from school to school, It's not that difficult once you have your core materials in to kind of write the supplementals and tweak your personal statement. And so long as you are okay with paying the application fee or you can get that fee waived, there's not really too high of a number of schools to apply to. I think try to contain it to, I would say, less than 15. But who knows? It depends on case to case for sure. So Nikki asked about the JDP program. What are the merits of it for you versus applying straight out of undergrad? For what were they for me? So I think this is a great question because I can really speak on it. So the JDP program, first of all, I'm just going to give a quick background for what it is. You apply your junior year. So the application is due months before the cycle would start your senior year of undergraduate. And so you are actually accepted in July of your before your senior year. So you're going to HLS 3 years before you go or more. You have the option to extend your deferral. For me, the merits were I knew that I wanted to get some life experience, both career and also personal. A statistic for you guys is that about 75% of 1Ls at HLS had at least 1 year between undergrad and law school. And I think it's like something around 65 had at least 2 years. So that's not to say that you have the odds against you necessarily if you are going straight through undergrad, but it certainly to me is a trend that law schools really want you to get some personal and professional experience in the real world. And to me, that was so important. Also, I like the security of being done with the process early on. Eugene asked, would you say a volunteer that is not related to law still matters? I have a full-time job, so getting a law-related volunteer would be very hard. So I think this is just in general about experiences, whether those are law-related or not law-related. I think it partially depends how far out you are from undergrad, but not really. Like they understand that there isn't, that there aren't that many law-related opportunities, and they're very limited when you are not, a lawyer or in law school. And so I think they understand that, and they're not really looking, law schools are not looking for people who have the most law-related things on their application. It's much more about just showing that you have some sort of story. And I think this concept is going to come up a lot. And it probably did in other sessions about personal statements and applications, that there's just this general and consistent narrative to your application that is shown throughout it. So whether that's law related, if you're someone who says, so for me, I'll give myself as an example, my area of interest was, and still is, international humanitarian law, which is the law of armed conflict. And my experiences and my major and my transcripts all reflected that, but they weren't law related. They were international relations related and geopolitics related. So even though it wasn't about the law, it sort of catered to that interest in which the law is about, if that makes sense. I'm going to look in here for another one. Oh, Nadia asks a great question. So any tips for tackling the mental component of the LSAT? What she's talking about is attitude, but also discipline, stamina, et cetera. So I think the mental component, especially when you've prepping, is you sort of put it to the side a little bit, and you just want to focus on the content. But once you've learned the content sufficiently, it all becomes a mental game. And I see this with so many of my clients, especially those who are later in the game and are really high scorers. The LSAT is a mind game, and so much of it comes down to your confidence and your ability to stay calm under pressure. And so something like discipline and stamina. So let's talk about those for a second. So discipline, I think, so for me, when I was an undergrad and I made the LSAT a priority, and the LSAT, I took it my junior year because you have to for the JDP, although many people take it later. I just basically made it priority number one. And when you mentally assign something priority number one, next to school, I kind of put them side by side. Everything else, you just work it around the LSAT. It's not about working the LSAT into your life. It's kind of working your life around the LSAT. And that it doesn't have to be toxic and it doesn't have to be draining. It just sort of means you are going to shift some things that maybe you typically prioritize to sort of accommodate the LSAT. And it's definitely sacrifices have to be made, but they don't have to be all encompassing, especially if you can sort of develop a good relationship with prepping. And then stamina, the other aspect. Stamina, I would say the most important thing is just to continually do PTs. I know repetition makes people go crazy, but that really is the name of the game in LSAT prep. It's one thing to be able to do a specific question when you're drilling that question type and you know what it's going to be. And it's another thing to do that in a full length section. And it's another thing to do that when it's question 24 on section 4 of the test. And the only way you can practice that third thing is by doing PTs. So for stamina, it's all about just PT practice, and your brain will sort of learn to allocate its energy across those 4 sections. But it takes time, for sure. For sure, it takes time. Let me keep reading here. Okay, Alexandra asked a great question about how should I prepare if a law school requires interviewing. So I love talking about interviews because I think the majority of people have interviews all wrong. So to take a step back, what an interview is, okay? It's not an opportunity to show them your, high-mindedness or your intellectual capabilities or your vocabulary or any of those things. Those are all shown in your application materials, which will be reviewed in the context of your interview and vice versa. They have your transcripts, your GPA, your LSAT, your essays, resume, all the above. That is how you show them yourself in an academic and professional sense. The interview is much more, it's all about fit. They're evaluating you on a more personal level. So rather than trying to appeal to, you're not interviewing with, in most cases, and as far as I'm concerned, you're not interviewing with a tenured law professor who lives in the ivory tower and reads the Constitution every day. You're interviewing with a member of the admissions committee, and they're people, and they're trying to build a class. And when they build that class, they're not just thinking about who has the best LSAT, best GPA. They're also thinking about fit in terms of, will these people mesh well together? Will they hang out outside of class? Will they form study groups together? So I think letting your personality shine through. So for my HLS interview, everyone who gets into the JDP has to do an interview. And for my interview, almost, I would say 75% of the interview, we weren't even really talking about law school. We were talking about hiking and electronic music festivals. And, obviously I came prepared and I had questions and I knew relevant things about HLS and their programs, but I was surprised at how little of the interview that took up. And so much more is about your personality shining through. And even when they are things about law school and your interests, it's all about just showing who you are as a person and saying, hey, I'm not a robot who's good at school. I'm also someone who has interests and a personality. So that's sort of my advice when it comes to that. I go to the bottom here. I'll try to get to all these guys. Sorry, there's a lot of questions. Okay, so Amanda asked a great question. Is there a major difference in acceptance when applying when applications first come out versus applying before Thanksgiving? So what Amanda's referring to is this kind of belief and semi-true belief in the law school admissions community that because applications are rolling, you're at an advantage the sooner you apply. Now, that's partially true because, somebody who applies in November is going to be better off than someone who applies in March because at that point, the class size has really closed. They've admitted so many people. They have quotas, and once they hit those quotas, it becomes much different. But when we're talking about September 1st versus Thanksgiving, the difference is marginal, truly. There is a lot of time in processing your applications. There's backlog. You never know when your application, even if you submit it September 1st, it might end up getting reviewed with people who submitted 3 weeks later. So there's not like a day by day dwindling chance of admission or boost. It's more about just getting them in sort of before Thanksgiving, like you said, is a great benchmark. But especially, and the most important thing is if come September 1st, you don't feel like you're fully ready, do not submit. It is better to wait even to wait after Thanksgiving and after winter break, if you think that your application, there's more to it, if you want to take the LSAT again, if you want to wait for your first semester grades to come in, if you want to refine your essays, you should only submit when your application is, you are satisfied with it fully. And if you think you're leaving anything on the table for the sake of applying early, don't do it. The only exception here is for ED. Obviously, those have stricter deadlines, and you have to have your stuff together for that. Let me see here. Okay, Edwin says, would a high GRE provide the same benefit for low GPA applicants as a high LSAT score? So I think when you're, at least the stated opinion of, expressly stated to the public is that they evaluate the GRE and the LSAT basically the same. The only consideration I would have, and the only consideration I've heard from people in the AdCom community and law schools in general, is that just because the GRE is a more recent addition and the LSAT is like the legacy test, I think people are more wowed by a high LSAT score, and that's just kind of personal bias. But it doesn't mean that they don't value the two the same on a statistical level. But generally, the LSAT is what's attributed to law school, and it's what they report on those ABA 509 forms that schools have to report their medians. So generally, I think the LSAT is going to have a little bit more of a wow factor, but it's not too much where if you get a much higher GRE score, you should obviously go with that. Let's see. Okay, so Sophia kind of asked a follow-up question to the rolling admissions question about taking the LSAT in August. So if you are taking the LSAT in August and you want to apply getting in as soon as you take the LSAT, I think you just mean as soon as you get your score back. You can apply September 1st and you'll probably have your score by then. So you can apply the day they open, the application's open. But I would be very open, and this is something I'm very candid about with all my clients, is taking the LSAT twice is not something anyone should be afraid of. And there's almost no downside to it. I myself took the LSAT twice. The first time I took it, I got a 173. I took it again and I got a 180. And I think had I not taken it again, my path would have been completely different. And I truly, and I've worked with many, dozens and dozens of LSAT clients, and almost every single one of them has seen a score increase between their first and second test. It just happens, even if they don't do a lot of prep in between. I think there's just a level of confidence and sort of knowing you have one score already in the bank that really just makes you feel a lot better. There's a mental component. So I would definitely be mindful and give yourself time if you want to take it again, and know that rolling admission does not mean that September 1st, everything after that, you're at a disadvantage, because that's not how it works at all. I'm going to keep going down here just to get through as many as I can. Okay, so Samantha asked a great question. What's the best way to begin working on a personal statement? Where should I start? I've been focusing on the LSAT, but I neglected it. So personal statements, where should you start? The personal statement at a very, very high level should answer the question, why law? But more importantly, why is getting a JD the next logical step in my life or my career? Because why law, we can often take these very abstract and broad approaches to, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. And I've definitely seen very effective personal statements do that. But you also are trying to basically sell the AdComs on the fact that you have really thought out why you want to go to law school, and you have a plan as to why getting a JD is so important and sort of represents that next logical step. And it doesn't mean that you need to know everything you want to do with your law career or your law degree. I would say the vast majority of people who write their applications and enter their 1L year don't, but it means that you sort of just want to have some idea of I'm about to undertake 3 years of extensive graduate education. That's a big financial commitment. I've thought this through and I have a reason for doing it. And so there are so many ways you can attack a personal statement. You can be very specific about why you want to practice law. You can talk about a personal story that sort of, impacted you and sort of led you to that. Um, and or you can just talk about sort of your journey, your intellectual academic career journey that sort of led you here. Um, all are great sort of starting points. I think um, everyone has their own kind of story, and how they spin it is on them. And so I would be happy to speak with you one on one about sort of how to structure your personal statement, but it's very personal, and there's no right way to do it. It just sort of should answer that broad question. Okay, so the Zoom user says, I feel somewhat behind. I'm going to take an LSAT prep course from May to July, take the test in September, and then apply by November. Is this a reasonable timeline? Well, first of all, I want to tell you that you don't have to feel behind at all. This is a pretty, I'm assuming that you are a junior in college. Sort of seems like it, but let me know if I'm wrong. Um, that's a very standard timeline to sort of take the test, to take it in September. That's very common. And again, I think this idea that September 1st is when applications open, so you have to get in by September 1st. That's not how it works in reality. There's sort of like, again, you want to get it in, before Thanksgiving or before winter break, but you know, those are those are malleable. And again, it should also be in when you are in the most advantageous position. So it's a great timeline. The only thing I would always tell everyone about the LSAT is, like I said before, allow yourself more time. If you feel like you are leaving things on the table, allow yourself more time to prep. Allow yourself maybe the chance to push your test back or even take it again. Um, any admissions boost that you lose by applying late will easily be offset by any increase in LSAT score that you leave on the table. Because ultimately, if they were just giving such priority to people who submit September 1st, then they would let no one in after February. But that's not how it works. People get let in. People get off of wait lists. It's very fluid. Um, Eugene asked for an applicant with 3+ years of work experience. Should they still get a recommendation letter from their undergrad professor along with the boss from work? If so, would getting the letter from their major classes, including senior thesis, be better than professors from minor courses? So this is a great question. I'm going to kind of zoom out and apply it more broadly, but the concept you're asking here is great, which is recommenders, sort of in regards to, should they be someone who is directly involved in your major? Or I have also seen it asked, is it better to get the dean of some school or some faculty head of a department versus some lower level professor? And the answer is, the prestige basically doesn't matter. Obviously, that's not a one size fits all prescription, but I can tell you in my example, I was told this by many people, you need to get sort of the top people in your school to write your letters of rec. I had a visiting associate faculty write one of my recs. It wasn't even fully a professor at the school yet, but I knew that this professor or this faculty would write the strongest rec because I had a very strong relationship with him. I had taken many classes with him, and I knew he'd speak to me. And I think what you need to think about as an applicant is put yourself in the shoes of adcoms, right? For my example, and I know we're not only talking about Harvard, but for my example, and this applies to any law school, HLS has seen thousands of letters of rec from the most powerful people in the world, I'm sure. They're not really going to be wowed one way or another by the prestige. And if you get the dean of your school to write a very cookie cutter letter of rec because he or she doesn't really know you, well, you kind of shot yourself in the foot, because that doesn't speak to your strengths at all. So your recommender should be someone, regardless of their position or their prestige, I should say, who speaks to your strengths and knows you well. Those are the valuable ones. They're looking for the people who you learned under, their honest words about you. And if they can speak strongly about you and it can be genuine, and believe me, they can tell when it's genuine versus when it's forced. They read thousands of these. That is what they prioritize 10 times out of 10. And I know that for a fact from conversations with HLS adcoms. Another question, does having a few years of work experience help make up for weaknesses like lower GPA/tests? So it's a great question. So kind of going back to what I said earlier, about how law schools, just generally speaking, prefer people who have, one or two or even more years of work experience, just because they probably believe it makes students more well-rounded. Um, they definitely prefer that. Now, does it make up fully for lower GPA or tests? Probably, not entirely, because one large consideration of law schools is those medians, and they have to report those every year, and that's a big source of pride for them. But it certainly is a good sell to them, and it can certainly help offset some of that, because you're basically saying, I'm not defined by my numbers. But when you are sort of what they call a KJD, which is a kindergarten through JD, meaning you've just continuously gone to school since kindergarten, um, all they really have to go off of is your numbers. And that was certainly the case for the JDP. I was a junior in college. No junior in college has done anything. Most juniors of college haven't done anything super notable, especially in the legal sphere. So it's a very, very numbers focused program. And that just goes for deferral programs in general. They're going to be a lot more numbers focused. So if that's a strength that you have, and you get your numbers in early, and you're good by your junior year, it's a great thing to look into. Um, but if not, definitely applying, getting some work experience is very powerful and can sort of make up for undergrad. Kyle asks, what did you focus on in your personal statement? You don't need to expand on the specifics, but I'm interested in how you framed your personal answer. Great. So great question. So I'm happy to go into the specifics of mine. So my interest is in IHL, which I talked about is sort of the laws of armed conflict. And I just sort of talked about how my whole life, I grew up around, war, Call of Duty video games, war movies. My family were all in the military. And so I sort of was steeped in this, and I sort of went on this journey from being, thinking it was cool as a little kid, like many young boys do, and then sort of getting to college and thinking, being like this sort of peacenik who was like, I just want global peace, and I wanted to do peace studies. And then I sort of, my major was international relations, and I read a lot of realist theory, and I would say, okay, maybe war is inevitable, but there has to be some way to mitigate and attenuate the suffering that comes with it. And then I sort of came to this sort of intersection of those two things, which is the idea that you can sort of, yes, maybe conflict is inevitable, but there's ways to contain it. There's laws that both parties can abide by that makes both sides better off. And that was sort of my story. And I sort of tracked that through my whole life, and I weaved in personal experiences and personal stories. Um, and yeah, and I sort of drew it all together. And my last paragraph, which is very important, is I sort of went looking forward, actionable ways that I would use my degree to, do work in the IHL sphere, so that I had done my research, so that this, the careers and professions do exist with this degree and this law practice area. So we're going to do a few more. We're sort of reaching the end, but I want to get a couple more in. Let's see here. So Leslie is asking a great question, and one that I was actually waiting for to be asked, because it's something that I talk about with a lot of people. So how in depth should one go when writing an addendum for a poor grade? Should I aim for half a page, 1 page, etc.? So I'm going to share my opinion on addenda overall, because I think that, like a lot of things, people sort of have them all wrong, because they're not looking at law school admissions through the mind of an adcom. They're looking at it from their point of view, which can be very difficult to get out of, but it's the most valuable skill you can learn. So what is an addendum? And I'll keep this brief because I know we're almost at the end. But what is an addendum? An addendum is used to explain something on your application that you feel needs to be explained. What actually qualifies for being, necessary or needing an addendum, I think is a lot smaller, and there's a lot less that people perceive. So I think things that sort of just happen, maybe you had a rough semester, or maybe you had a class where you retook it, you received an A, whatever it was. Oftentimes you actually can be harming yourself by writing an addendum for a couple of reasons. Number one, you're actually drawing attention to something that they would probably just gloss over. Um, like you to you it might feel like the end of the world, but to them they might not even notice it, and you might actually be falsely drawing attention to it. Um, but also a lot of these things, they kind of look at adcoms, and I know this again for a fact from many conversations with HLS adcoms, that they don't like it when students write an addendum on something very minor. It's almost like, for example, if someone took the LSAT a bunch of times, or they had a rough semester or something, and they sort of write a whole story out, they sort of see it. It's just kind of like a red flag for them, because it's just, that happened and that's part of your story, and maybe it doesn't necessitate a full explanation. um just sort of, you don't want to over exaggerate an event, or try to, just, I think they respect and they appreciate when people just kind of own it. And that's not to say, Leslie, that you shouldn't write an addendum, because there's a lot, it's a much, every case, again, especially with addenda, is so specific. But to answer your question, if you are going to write an addendum and you think that this is something that you need to do, less is more. I cannot stress it enough. Um, this is not an essay. You cannot treat an addendum like an essay. It is an explanation, and you are literally just explaining what happened and why it happened, if you feel you need to. Um, it's not a chance for you to write another essay. It's not a chance to sort of show off your wordplay or something. It's just cut and dry. This happened and this is why. And and how to frame it and how to write it. There's, we could talk more specifics on your case, but less is absolutely more. In the same way that you only want to write it if you absolutely think they need to see it, you should only to give them information that they absolutely need. The last thing you want to do is open yourself up to potential criticisms, or more, scrutiny than you actually need. So that's my response to that. And I know we are at time, so I just want to say thank you guys for joining today. You guys all had great questions. Um, and it's very good that people are thinking about the things they're thinking about. And I know law school admissions can be a very stressful process, but I am always happy to help. You can book a intro call with me on Leland here, and I'm happy to assist you guys. And other than that, I really appreciate it. I wish you guys all a great evening, and best of luck.